All right, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy, which may be the story that Norman Bowker in Tim O'Brien's notes suggests that Tim write. It may be the story that becomes, speaking of courage, in the things they carried, the story that Norman is not a fan of. Now you're going to see a lot of different colored highlights in my document here. Well, sorry, a lot of highlights, but only two different colors. The yellows are the ones I'm going to talk about first, and the yellows are the ones that relate directly between Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy and Speaking of Courage. So, for example, this one is about Paul Berlin, who is imagining talking to his dad and telling him about his experiences in the war. All of the yellows will be about Speaking of Courage, and Norman Bowker had a similar experience where he was driving around the lake imagining talking to his father. The orange ones are connections between Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy and other stories and the things they carried, and I'll deal with those at the end. So I've already talked about the first one. The second one is Paul Berlin, who really wants to get clean, and Norman Bowker, in Speaking of Courage, felt the same way. Here, Paul Berlin is obsessed with the texture and the smell of the muck. Norman Bowker was obsessed with the smell and the texture of the muck. Here's another example of Paul Berlin wanting to talk to his dad and being concerned about how his dad feels about him. It's another example of Paul Berlin obsessed about the smell and texture of the land. Another example of Paul Berlin imagining talking to his dad and imagining something about the relationship here with the dad's stern eyes. Here's an interesting connection between the two stories. These guys are talking about telling the time, but in Speaking of Courage, you might remember that Norman Bowker can tell time without using a watch. And he also, the last thing he sees on Kiowa before Kiowa goes under is Kiowa's wristwatch. In Speaking of Courage, there are mortar rounds that fall everywhere, and they are what causes Kiowa to get sucked into the muck. And when Kiowa goes under, his eyes are wide open when he goes under. This passage from Charming Billy is how Billy is described when they find him. So one is about Kiowa's death and one is about Billy being found. Here's yet another example where he's imagining talking to his dad. You may remember that in notes in the things they carried, Tim O'Brien said that the emotional core of the story came from the simple need to talk. And you can really see that permeate this story. I'm going to go back to the beginning and explain some of the orange highlights. The very first one is a little bit reminiscent of the listening patrol in the mountains, where the soldiers have to be extremely quiet, and it's for so long and for so many days that they start to lose their cool, and they call in an airstrike. All of these orange highlights, for me, remind me of Jimmy Cross, particularly because of this one. He digs his foxhole and he holds Martha's letters. But also, he makes a lot of promises to himself after Ted Lavender dies about ways he wants to make changes in his life to be a better soldier. And here, Paul Berlin does the same thing. He goes through the same sort of inventory of behaviors that he wants to change. This one is a little bit reminiscent of characters in the things they carried who step on landmines and lose a limb. Lee Strunk was one. Kurt Lemon was another who stepped on a landmine. This is one of the most interesting ones to me because it's this description of Billy Boy. He gets this sort of simile description. He's compared to a diver, as if somebody had sort of dived and was, when they hit the earth, was sort of frozen there in that position, and that's the position in which they find Billy Boy. Now, in a chapter that, in a story that you haven't probably read yet, in the things they carried, it's called In the Field. It's a story in which they are searching for Kiowa's body, and when they find him, look at this. He's described, the position of his body is like a diver who had plunged headfirst off a high tower. Pretty similar to how Billy Boy Watkins was described. Long and dangerous dive. Similarly, when they find Billy Boy Watkins down here, he's green and covered with algae. And if you go back to the same moment in the field, you'll see that when they find Kiowa, he's covered with a bluish-green mud. So imagine you're Norman Bowker and you're reading this story about Billy Boy Watkins and you're reading descriptions of how he was found. That might call to mind some of your memories of Kiowa's death. Here's another one that's pretty cool. When they find Billy Boy Watkins, there's really three things about this moment that are key for me as a reader. First, the soldiers wade in after him. Secondly, with their rifle butts, they perform this action of probing for Billy Boy and the stinking patty. If you compare that with this moment from in the field, it's the very beginning of the chapter. Look at this. The soldiers use the butts of their weapons as probes, wading. So this wading is in both texts. The probing is in both texts, and the items that they use are in both texts. Now, certainly, many soldiers would have used the butts of their weapons for many things, right? But the reuse of these words and ideas and images, I think, further connect the two texts with each other. The last one I'm going to point out is just kind of comical. Here, Paul Berlin's thinking about funny war stories. We've read a lot of the things they carried about true war stories, and I just thought that was interesting to note. I'm curious what you thought of Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy?